The Granite Mountain Hotshots were an elite group of 20 firefighters stationed or based out of Prescott, Arizona. These guys are trained to walk several miles carrying 40 to 50 pounds of equipment, including chainsaws, in order to do their work. They'll even sleep in the area where they are fighting a fire in order to protect homes. In late June of this year, small town of Yarnell, Arizona, was threatened by a fire. It is a few miles from Prescott. As these guys were out fighting the fire, about 4 p.m. on June 30th, winds dramatically turned 180 degrees and began whipping the 25 to 50 feet flames of fire toward the crew with winds that were gushing up to 50 miles an hour. When it was obvious the fire was going to overrun them, the 19 members deployed their fire shields or shelters, which is a light aluminum blanket designed to block much of the heat and the gases from the flames. Really, these are usually only used as a last resort. The men huddled close to the ground, hoping the fire would pass over the top of them. But 2 hours after they called and said they were deploying their shelters, the 19 firefighters were found dead. Daniel was a young, intelligent Jewish male deported to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar when Judah was defeated by the Babylonians. Because Daniel was able to both describe a dream and then interpret what that dream meant, something no one else in the entire Babylonian kingdom was able to do, Nebuchadnezzar gave Daniel a very prominent role in his government, along with Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you're there in Daniel chapter 3, we note in verses 1 through 12, King Nebuchadnezzar built this 90-foot tall statue, overlaid it with gold, and then issued a decree that whenever certain music was played, the people of the kingdom were to bow down and worship the statue. When some of the king's officials heard that these 3 Hebrew young men were not complying with the king's orders, they ratted out these 3 guys to the king. And we're going to pick up our story here in Daniel chapter 3 and verse 13 with the king's angry reaction to the civil disobedience of these 3 followers of God. Folks, we never know what trials that we may experience. We never know what fires we are going to go through in life. And so as we read this today, we need to know that however small, however severe may be the storms that we face in life, the courage of these Hebrew heroes should inspire us and encourage us to be faithful to our Lord. So I'm going to start by just reading verses 13 through 17. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I'm going to give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty." Take out the outlines there on the inside of your bulletin. Verses 13 through 17, we see, first of all, these 3 Hebrew heroes believed in an omnipotent God. You remember the pride you feel when you build something with your own hands, or maybe you bake a wonderful cake and you think, wow, that is good. That's how Nebuchadnezzar felt when he built this 90-foot. That's 9 stories. That's as tall as the tall corn towers. 90-foot tall. And then he overlaid the statue with gold. There was a lot of pride he had at what he had built. So when these three Jews were not bowing down to his golden idol, verse 13 tells us the king flew into a rage. In other words, he was more than mad. He was beyond upset. His skin on his face probably became very tight. The color of his face turned red. The contours of his face changed shape. His voice grew very loud. Do you have any idea who it is that you are dealing with? You have any idea at all? I'm going to give you one more chance to do what I tell you to do, or else. Fact is, Satan has been threatening God's people with those words, or else, for a long time. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were not being religiously intolerant. They weren't being hateful towards anyone as they refused to worship this idol. They weren't in Nebuchadnezzar's face. They weren't shouting obscenities at him or threatening him in any way. They quietly went about their business, but they simply could not maintain a clear conscience before God and worship Nebuchadnezzar's idol. Couldn't do it. I don't know if you read Paul Tambrino's column in the Times Republican called Ask Augustine, but here is a recent question that he addressed. And I share it because I've heard even some Christians ask this question. And the question is this: is it not arrogant to claim that Jesus is the only way to God? In other words, isn't it somewhat exclusive of Christians to think that they have the only God? Tambrino replied, and I'm quoting, "It is important to understand that Christianity is not the only religion that claims exclusivity." And then he pointed out or cited some quotes from Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism, the Sikhs, etc. And he continues, "And since atheists reject the viewpoint of those who believe in God, they also are exclusive. Therefore, it is not true that Christianity is arrogant when it claims exclusivity. Every other major religion does so as well." And several hundred years before the time of Jesus Christ, King Nebuchadnezzar shows us the mindset of a religiously intolerant individual. I love the answer these three courageous Jews gave to the king. If we are thrown into the fiery furnace, O Nebuchadnezzar, the God whom we serve is able to rescue us. We know that. We believe that. And you better believe that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had come to believe that concept that nothing is impossible with God long before they came to this encounter with Nebuchadnezzar. Long before, in their minds, they knew that nothing is too difficult for God, that anything is possible with that individual who believes. It was a conviction that when they came to this time and this place in their life, that conviction served them well as this unbelieving king asked them to do what they simply could not do: worship an idol instead of worship God. Now, Nebuchadnezzar should have known better than question God. Turn to chapter 2. In chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a very disturbing dream. He asks all of his learned and wise men in the kingdom to tell him what he dreamed and then interpret the dream for him. And these guys are all like, no, you tell us the dream, we'll interpret it for you. He says, nuh-uh. You tell me the dream and interpret. They said, that's impossible. That cannot be done. And since no one could do what the king asked them to do, he determined he was going to kill all of these learned individuals throughout Babylon. Well, Daniel hears of this. Daniel goes to his three Hebrew friends, and the four of them begin praying and petitioning God and asking God to reveal to Daniel what is it that the king dreamed, and then what does that dream mean? So when Daniel was able to eventually tell Nebuchadnezzar his dream and what the dream meant, the king's reaction was to throw himself down to Daniel. And he says in verses 46 and 47, truly, your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, the revealer of mysteries, for he is the one who gave you this information. So Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, he should have known from this experience in chapter 2 that God could do anything. And yet he forgets. We come to chapter 3 and he's forgotten about what God could do. I wonder how many of us have seen God's omnipotent power at work in the past, but then like Nebuchadnezzar, we forget when we come up against something in the present. We've seen God's miracles in the past. He's demonstrated himself to us. But now, once again, here we are, and we find ourselves doubting again. Why is that? Jesus' disciples saw him perform miracle after miracle, day after day. So when Jesus asked Philip where they could buy bread to feed what some people estimate was 20,000 people, you know it as the feeding of the 5,000? That's just the men, 5,000 men. The Hebrews numbered the men. There could have been 20,000 there as you add in the women and the children. And Jesus asked Philip, where are we going to find the bread to feed all these people? Philip says, well, I tell you, there isn't enough bread in the whole region to feed that mass of people, Lord. As a matter of fact, even if there was enough bread, it'd take a small fortune to buy that much bread. And when Simon Peter found this little boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 little fish, he says, what is that amongst such a huge crowd of people? Well, you know the story. Jesus taught his disciples that nothing is impossible with God. When Gideon routed an army of 135,000 Midianites, and that's more than the population of Cedar Rapids, I think. And you know how many people he did that with? 300. 300 soldiers routed the Midianite army of 135,000. Gideon found out that nothing is impossible with God. So, what impossible situation are you dealing with right now? What is there going on in your life right now that you've already concluded, man, that's beyond what God can do? Jesus said, anyone who believes in me will do even greater things than I have done. What? Yeah. Anyone who believes in me will do even greater things than Jesus did. Really? That's what he said. If we believe. In the midst of what we think are impossible situations, and we're going through these storms in our lives, Jesus asked us the same question that he asked of Martha when he raised Martha's brother Lazarus from the dead. Did I not tell you, Martha, that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? You and I need to decide if we believe that nothing is impossible with God. Because if we don't, then all we've got is a half-hearted faith. If we don't believe that nothing is impossible with God, why pray? Why read the Bible? Why attend church? But if we do believe that nothing is impossible with God, then we need to start praying it. We need to start believing it so that we can see the miracles that Jesus has promised to do. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I mean to tell you, they believed in an omnipotent God with whom nothing is impossible. How about us? Verse 18. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, Your Majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. He ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up, threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. We see in verses 18 through 23, these 3 individuals trusted in a sovereign God. How is this for faith? We know that God can save us if He wants to. But even if He chooses not to, for whatever reason, we're not going to serve you. If God chooses to save us, great. If God allows us to suffer, we'll deal with that as well. But nothing and no one is going to change our mind. Nothing and no one is going to shake our confidence or our love for God. Nothing. Can we say that? The word sovereign simply means God is in control. There is absolutely nothing that happens in this universe which is outside of God's influence or outside of God's authority as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. God has no limitations. I said no, none. No limitations on what God can do. God has no need for explanations on what God has done. My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts, He says to us. How impossible it is for us to understand God's decisions and His ways. For who of us can know the Lord's thoughts? Who of us knows enough to give God advice? For everything comes from God. Everything exists because of God's power. Now, I know we don't like unanswered questions. When a child is physically or sexually abused, or worse yet, locked up for 10 years, we wonder why. When we are robbed, when someone close to us betrays our confidence or our trust, when things happen to us that we don't understand, we lose our job, we ask the question, why? When Jesus hung on the cross, those who were there, those who were His followers, asked the question, why? Why did this happen? Well, there were mockers there who shouted, hey, if you really are the Son of God, save yourself, come down from that cross. And mockers still repeat the same refrain today. If God is real, why does He allow suffering? If God is real, why does He allow rape? If God is real, why does He allow the guilty to go unpunished? If we really believe that God is sovereign, if we really believe that God is in control, then we will trust that God knows what He's doing in every situation, whether we understand it or not. Why did 19 firefighters of the Granite Mountain Hot Shots crew die on June 30th? Why? I mean, think about this. How many other firefighting crews had been in similar situations throughout the years without suffering fatalities? For that matter, why was this one particular individual, why was his life spared and not the other 19? Why him? Why them? Believe me, I've asked myself that a lot of times in the 27 years since I was first diagnosed with cancer. Why am I still here? 27 years. We don't always know all the answers to all the questions of life. But the psalmist writes, the Lord has made the heavens His throne. From there He rules over everything. Daniel said God controls the course of world events. He removes some kings, He sets up other kings. When describing the God to the people of Athens whom they did not know, the Apostle Paul said He is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since He is Lord of heaven and Lord of earth, He doesn't live in man-made temples. He Himself gives life and breath to everything, and He satisfies every need. From one man, God created all the nations of the whole earth. He decides when nations should rise and when nations should fall. He decides what the boundaries of those nations should be. God rules over everything. He is in complete control of all things. He has power and authority over nature. He has power and authority over the kings of this earth. He has the power and authority over history. He has power and authority over the angels and demons of the universe. Even Satan has to have permission from God before he can do anything. And this sovereign God promises to you and I that in all things He works for the good of those who love Him and those who trust in Him fully. And brothers and sisters, the only way that God can make that kind of a promise, mean it and then keep it, is to be an omniscient, omnipotent God who is totally consumed with His love for you and I. More so than we can even comprehend. Because God is sovereign. Nothing is ever going to happen to my life or your life that God hasn't first signed off on. Whatever we come up against, His promise is this: He will use it for our good. He will empower us to more than conquer the trials that we face, whatever they may be. And the question you and I have to ask ourselves before we get to those trials is this: do we really trust Him? Do we really believe Him? Do we really believe that He is sovereign? Now I ask you, what trial will you ever experience that is greater than what these three guys were going through? Will we ever experience anything like that? They totally trusted God. Do we? King Nebuchadnezzar was so irate, he commanded the furnace to be stoked 7 times hotter than it already was. He had some of his most experienced and strongest soldiers tie up these three guys. Now, why did he go through that? They weren't kicking and screaming. They weren't putting up a fight. Had he asked them, they probably would have walked into the furnace. Matter of fact, when the soldiers went to throw them in, who was it that ended up losing their lives? It was the strong, experienced Babylonian soldiers. These three guys, these three Hebrew young men, they were grounded in their core convictions. They were trained in the truth. They could not be compromised. Their kind of faith insists on obedience. Their faith is a determined duty. Jesus said, when you obey me, you should say, we are unworthy servants who are simply doing our duty. Shame on us. Listen to me. Shame on us when we think we deserve extra credit because we obeyed God. Shame on us when we think we have lived so good that God really ought to be pleased with us. Because when we obey God, we are doing nothing more than what we're supposed to do. Obedience to God is not something that extra above average disciples carry out. It is the call, it is the duty of everyone who considers themselves a follower of Jesus Christ. I will obey Him. I will do whatever He calls me to do, wherever He calls me to go. Psalmist writes, I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. The three Hebrew men were prepared to honor the Lord in their lives or in their deaths. Paul wrote in the New Testament, for me, living is for Christ, dying is gain. While we live to please the Lord. When we die, we go to be with the Lord. So whether in life or in death, we belong to the Lord. They trusted in a sovereign God. Verses 24 through 30. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Yes, Your Majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Look! I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god. Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, the officials, the governors, the advisors crowded around them and saw, listen to this, the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command, were willing to die rather than to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble, for there is no other God who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. So we see in verses 24 through 30, they walked with an omnipresent God. Can we picture King Nebuchadnezzar's face when he looks into the fire from afar, obviously, and he sees not 3 men, but 4 men walking around inside the furnace like they were at the Y getting some exercise. Their ropes had burned off. Their clothes were still intact. And this fourth person looked like a god. Fact is, I believe it was God. I believe it was Jesus Christ. If you look at the Greek of the Hebrew of this, it is the only place in the Old Testament where the term Son of God is used. After all, was it not Jesus who promised that where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am in their midst? Was it not Jesus who promised to the disciples, "I am with you always, even to the very end of the age"? In fact, the Lord is never far from any one of us. He has promised never to leave us or forsake us. God assures us, when you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fires of oppression, you will not be burned up and the flames will not consume you. For I am the Lord your God. Do not be afraid, whatever you go through, for I am with you. Speaking of the omnipresence of God, John Wesley said in a sermon he preached in the year 1788, "There is no point of space, whether within or without the bounds of creation, where God is not." Marine scientists were studying the carcass of a rare colossal squid that had an eye measuring 11 inches in diameter. What I'm saying to you is that eye was bigger than most dinner plates that you and I eat off of. Can you imagine what it would be like having a pair of eyes that big following you wherever you went, staring at you wherever you went? Fact of the matter is, nothing in all creation is hidden from God. He sees everything. Everything is exposed before His eyes. And furthermore, He is the one to whom you and I are all accountable. Psalmist asks, "You know everything about me. You know when I sit down. You know when I stand up. You know my thoughts. You see me when I travel. You see me when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I am going to say even before I say it. You watched me as I was being formed in my mother's womb." The fact of the matter is, the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear Him. The eyes of the Lord are on those whose hope is in His unfailing love. God sees everything that goes on because God is everywhere we are. Many years ago, the Philadelphia Bulletin newspaper reported, many years ago, about a professor from a training school sitting next to this young kid on a shuttle train. He's holding in his hands this Sunday school lesson paper, and so the professor, wanting to have a little fun with the boy, says to him, "Young man, tell me where God is, and I'll give you an apple." Young boy looks at him and says, "You tell me where God isn't, and I'll give you a whole bushel full of apples." I wonder what conversation Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were carrying on with Jesus in that furnace. What were they talking about? What were they singing? I wonder if they even noticed the flames of fire around them. Probably not. Wonder if they cared at all. They were in the presence of Jesus. Jesus promised us we will have troubles in this world. In fact, some of the times our troubles are going to be a result of the fact that we know Him, that we love Him, and we follow Him. But one thing we know for certain is this: The Lord either saves us from our troubles or he walks with us through our troubles. Did you get that? The Lord either saves us from our troubles or he walks with us through our troubles. Don't ever forget that. Which is precisely why David would write, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." There are only two ways to live in life, folks. Only two ways to experience this journey that we are on. We can either go through life alone, choice that we make, and do so in an ordinary, normal way, just like the vast majority of the people in our world, or we can go through life with Jesus Christ, and in doing so, we can experience life like nobody else does. You and I make the choice. Fire is a picture of persecution, a picture of trials. A furnace heated 7 times hotter than its normal represents, to me, the worst kind of destruction imaginable. But the picture of 3 people walking in such a storm with peace and security, without a care in the world, because Jesus is there walking with them, is a picture worth keeping in our minds. The only explanation for the boldness and the courage and the peace of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the presence of the Son of God, Jesus Christ. On Monday morning, October 2nd, 2006, a 32-year-old man armed with an automatic rifle and 400 rounds of ammunition entered a one-room Amish school in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. Charles Roberts ordered the boys in that one-room schoolhouse and the teacher to leave. Tied up the legs of the 10 girls who remained. The oldest hostage, a 13-year-old girl, begged Roberts to shoot me first, let the little ones go. He didn't listen to her. Shot all 10. 5 were killed. 5 were critically wounded. And then as the police stormed the schoolhouse, he killed himself. By the next morning, the small little town was flooded with 50 television crews all around Nickel Mines, staying for 5 days till all of the funerals were done, including that of the killer. The Amish families impacted by the shootings, put yourself in their position. They immediately extended forgiveness. Immediately. To the shooter. They immediately extended love to his family. Within a week of the shootings, more than 2,400 stories in all of the major media outlets centered on forgiveness. And the unusual response of the Amish people to this tragedy. Of the 75 people who attended Charles Roberts' funeral, half of them were the Amish families affected by what he had done. His widow was deeply moved by the presence of these people, the love they extended to her and her 3 children. Their forgiveness went beyond just talk. It went beyond just showing up at a funeral service. They set up a monetary fund to support the murderer's family. Because God is sovereign, only God knows why that tragedy occurred on October 2nd, 2006. But because God is omnipotent, an entire Amish community was able to demonstrate a divine forgiveness unfathomable to the unredeemed mind. Know this. Whatever you go through in life, however severe and tragic may be the circumstances of your life, Jesus Christ is there. He's walking with you.